Hello and welcome to Unsung Sport, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes of the sports you love. Today I'm joined by Pete Lowe, who spent 13 years at Manchester City as a coach before writing The Language of Winning and setting up his own company, Players Net, where he specialises in helping create a winning mindset. Pete, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome, Mark.
I know what you do, actually, there's a lot broader than that, but I can only have so much in an intro, so I'm sure we'll come on to that in a bit.
Yeah, you're right.
To get a sense of the work you do today, Pete, it'd be great to hear about your journey, I guess, from PE teacher to head of education and performance at City.
Seems like a million years ago, Mark, to be quite honest with you. I'm smiling here, laughing, because that's exactly what it is. Yeah, I was a PE teacher for 13, 14 years. I ended up getting an offer from Oldham Athletic. Would I go and join them in a part-time capacity, which is what I did. 97, I think it was. Sorry, 92, I apologise. That long ago, Mark, I can't remember the years. And then I ended up moving to City in July of 2000 and left them in 2013, I think. Took some time out from everything. Set my own company up, which is firstteam.net. Or it's called First Team, but I now go under the name of PeteLowe.com because I've revamped everything, if you like. I quite like .com. Apparently, it's supposed to be really sexy these days, Mark. I haven't got a bloody clue, to be quite honest.
It's hard to get, to be honest.
Correct. Well, I've got one, mate. Let's put it that way. Anyway, I still do some work in professional sport and in football in particular. But I mainly work in business these days. I might well be moving quite soon into the game of, or the world of, shall we say, I'm going to use the word psychology. Not sure it's the right word, but that's with a company based in Canada. So that's really interesting stuff. It essentially, Mark, it's performance management. You know, it's how coaches get better. It's how players get better, because players will get better if coaches get better as well. It's symbiotic, that. It works both ways. It's not just a one-way street. And, of course, the other stuff I do is in business. Wrote my own book, The Language of Winning. In the midst of writing my second book, Dreams, Obsession, Fears and Tears, which is a journey that a parent needs to take, if you like, in helping their child move into the world of high performance.
Right, interesting. And when's the release date on that one?
I'm not sure yet, mate. If I'm honest with you, it has been delayed. It's called, shall we say, motivation, and too many other things to do, mate.
Too many distractions.
Yeah, there are a few at the moment.
Fair enough. And in terms of those URLs, I'm going to put a link to all of those in the summary notes here, so people can look that up on YouTube. I guess, can you tell me what the role of head of education and performance entails and how that fits into a club like Manchester City?
Well, it isn't just Manchester City it fits into. It has to fit into every academy that has a Category 1 / Category 2 categorisation for their academy. Every player who becomes an apprentice player, in the old days we used to call them an apprentice, now we call them football scholars. If you can work that one out, you're a better man than I am. But anyway, there we are. And part of that is that their training week has to entail continued education programmes. And I'm talking academic education programmes, by the way, Mark. So, you know, that is there in case they, I guess, crash and burn as players and they don't make it to the grade, of which the majority don't. And so they've got something to fall back on. I take the view, by the way, that I like the education stuff because we took the view that educated players are driven players and easy to coach, or easier to coach. They pick up information, they take it on board, they're able to use and utilise lots of pieces of information, which players have to do these days. It's not just a bag of wind they kick round, by the way. They have to handle pressures and all types of issues like that. So the head of education would be responsible for developing those education programs for the players and ensuring that they were carried through. He might not do the teaching. I never did the teaching, but it was my job to facilitate the development of those programs.
Yeah. And what were the biggest challenges in that role?
Ensuring that players understood that it had a part to play in their development as a footballer. And getting buy-in from some staff who might not think that it has a role to play. But it does. One of my ex-managers said to me that he wanted educated players. Take from that what you want.
Would you say there's less freedom in the game today?
I think there's freedom to express yourself in the game. All top players find a way of expressing themselves in the game. Actually, during the game itself, they find a way in which to do that. Away from the pitch, there's certainly less freedom because you've got a journalistic world which is mad on sport and especially big names. You've got a whole social media network which, with respect, players indulge in as well, by the way. So if you indulge in something, you're going to have to take what it throws back at you. And that's not easy. But the game is off the field, is inside a goldfish bowl now. But on the field, if you play for a manager inside of a culture who believes that players have to play with their soul to be any good and to be able to express themselves, he will let them express themselves. Obviously, within a boundary of what a team has to do. There has to be boundaries. Players have players to mark from set pieces like corners, from wide free kicks, from central free kicks in defending situations. They're expected to do things from attacking situations. So, whilst that's, if you like, it sounds a bit like the Red Arrows. Excuse me. It probably is. But then there's the freedom to express yourself inside the game. There's some great players in the Premier League, Mark. There really is. There's some seriously gifted players. And, you can't shackle players for 90 minutes. You've got to let them go.
Yeah, I think there was a quote from Ancelotti. I think I mentioned this on a previous podcast, but Ancelotti said that sometimes managers do try to coach that out of players, and it becomes so robotic and they're so focused on set pieces and set plays, and actually it does stifle that creativity and flair and entertainment side of the game.
No question about that. And you know what? Set pieces will always have a part to play, but it is a significant part. But if you were to analyse how much percentage of the game would be from set pieces where you have a real opportunity of a strike at goal, shall we say, and that'll be minimal compared to the free play in the game.
And what role does the data and analytics side now play in optimising player performance and development? And how's that changed, I guess, from your time? I know you were coaching for 25 years across Oldham and City, but and data does seem to be becoming more prevalent and more important. How has that changed?
Well, I think that, football's got into the 21st century, for the want of a better way of putting it. Using data and stuff is a skill. Some places do it clearly better than others. I remember it coming in for the first time in the academy at Manchester City, and it was like, whoa, what's this? But the guy who came in and did it, Adam Collins, is a real clever lad. And if you use these mindsets correctly, what they do is give you more than stats and numbers, Mark. They give you ways of doing things. They show you weaknesses. They show you where weaknesses can be exploited via numbers and things. So it's not just a case of being intuitive. It's a case of being extremely imaginative. But it's also a way of showing players that parts of the game that they themselves have got to develop in, shall we say. without using it as a tool to destroy a player's mindset. That's the real secret. It has to be used correctly.
Yeah. And on that, I guess, I mean, how do you address that mental and emotional well-being of players within an academy system?
That's a brilliant question. I mean, we could spend all day speaking about that alone, to be quite honest with you. Do you know what? The whole thing is, it is about people who work with players have to be switched on to players' needs, not just their own needs. We're coaching, we're coaching players. They are therefore more important than us because they are the game, plain and simple. And so recognizing, number one, that every player is different is a very big thing. They all have their own idiosyncrasies. They've all got their own personal lives. There are things from their personal lives that are significant to them and will affect at times their performance. And you have to know those things. Knowing the background of a player is a very big thing. Knowing, as much as you can do about him. Some people would call it being nosy. I call it being passionately curious. I think there's a significant difference. You're doing it for the right reasons. Because this knowledge that you gather about him, when he one day crashes and burns and falls off the edge of the cliff, you might know why. And that's a little into how you may be able to help him. It's not just about coaching football. You've got to be a father, a mother, a wife, a husband, but most of all, a mentor. That's, I took the view that you coach people, not footballers.
Yeah, I think people sometimes forget that and they just see them as very young, talented, but millionaires with idyllic lifestyles, no problems that go on. But we had Hugo Schechter on a few weeks back, and certainly in terms of that player care is becoming more important. I'm still surprised that that's not a mandated department in clubs. It's not at the moment. It's a nice to have.
Yeah, you're right. It's a question of how it's applied. But that goes for everything inside of a football club, by the way. Do you know what, Mark? You can discuss everything that a player needs. None of it works if the mindsets that are holding what has to be done aren't convivial to what needs to be done. If mindsets are negative to something, like data, for example, when it first came in, people would just go, number crunchers. But that's all changed now. Psychologists, for example, I don't need to speak to a psychologist, would be answers. I know people who do that job who have faced numerous obstacles from inside the organisations. Because, you see, the thing is, when you deal with something that doesn't have numbers or black and white detail, right, it's literally just out there on the clouds, isn't it? And some people take that as an opportunity to not accept it. But the simple reality is players at any level, of any standard, with potential, should have somebody to speak to. And it doesn't matter who it is. If they choose the cleaner, I'm all right with that. Simple as that. And when the knock comes on the door, and there'll be one, by the way, you've got to find time.
And I guess that on that point then, in terms of the role that you had there, and I guess before the money came into City, because you were there throughout that transition period, I guess, when the huge money came in, how did your department or the club just transition from pre-money to the billions that they have available now?
That in itself is a very good question. We used to be based at Platt Lane, not where the training ground is now. So to some degree, we were still an island, Mark. We were a really successful island, by the way. Mega successful, actually, in terms of player development. I never once gave it a minute's thought. It was never about money to me. I came through a system that had very small budgets, and yet still generated dozens of players. So money changes everything, there's no question, but only if you let it change it appropriately. So it can have a very negative adverse effect. People could and may well have done, they might rub their hands and go, "Oh, whopping big budgets now." And they may well have done that. I never saw that, by the way. But I have to say, from my personal perspective, I never gave it a minute's thought. I didn't think it was going to make any difference to how I did a job with a footballer.
And I see, I'm touching on that because I did pull up a stat from your website, actually. I see that from your website, there were 39 prospects graduated to the first team and 23 of those becoming full internationals, which is a fantastic record. Were there any standout players that you remember? And it's hard. That might be an unfair question to pick on any particular players, but any that really stood out.
There are players that you look back. I mean, the number at international level, by the way, is 30 now, I believe. No, that's okay. Don't get it. That's fine. There are players that clearly stand out in the game that have had fantastic careers. Sean Wright Phillips was our first, and a fantastic flag bearer for our academy. On top of the fact that he was actually an outstanding young man as well. I spoke to him 3 or 4 years ago for the first time in ages, and he was just the same. So it gives you great pride when you see that, to be quite honest with you. Just before I go on to other names, Mark, it's really important for me to say this. Coaches don't make players. Coaches might think they make players. They don't. They're just the catalyst for players developing. That's all they are, a catalyst. You put players on a training ground with better players than them, and they have to step up to the grade of the better players. Otherwise, the system naturally loses them. It's as simple as that. That's how tough it is. So, if you look at people like Kieran Trippier, who's had a marvellous, marvellous career at Newcastle, has become an outstanding footballer. Ben Mee down at Brentford has done terrifically well. As I say, Sean, we had Stephen Ireland, we had Michael Johnson, who had he not got the injuries that he got, may well have been a superstar for a long time. So we all know he was a bit of a player. And in fairness, there are others who did well, but maybe not as well as they should have done. So there are always standout names, Mark. I don't like picking them, if I'm honest.
No. And it's always an unfair question. Funnily enough, I mean, Michael Johnson was one of those that, again, I support West Ham, so but he was one that everybody was raving about, and unfortunately, just got those injuries. It just curtailed his career.
A terrific footballer. At that time, he was a modern day footballer. Could go box to box, pass the ball with both feet, and score a goal. And games get won on goals.
Yeah, I support West Ham, so apart from the other night, I know what that's about. So, You mentioned there that there was some players that you. I guess every coach has these stories where there's players that you think actually would go on to do a lot better. I mean, injuries is one thing, but do you think the mindset now sometimes maybe it's the money's too big in the game, or they just fall out of love with it? How can a young prospect keep up that mentality to really keep pushing on?
Do you know, the question you asked there is so well founded, and in it there are loads of questions in itself. But generalising, mindset plays a massive, massive part. And it's not just in football, it's in everything that we do in life, isn't it? This aspect of having growth mindset, if you like, going down the road of science now, is just a ginormous thing. It's not partly important, it's just massively important. But then you mix it with the desire to create a hard work ethic and not rely on talent. Because where players rely on talent, the dropout rate is quite huge. But where players understand that they develop their talent through a hard work ethic, Now we have a partial recipe for success. And then we throw in things like understanding how they create their authentic self. You know, so they come across to people as consistent, not frightened of expressing their vulnerabilities. I know these are modernisms of today's world, but they're nonetheless true at the end of the day, because fear is the biggest obstacle of the lot. It's the number one obstacle that a player will ever face. And it's the number one obstacle in life that we all face, is the fear of doing things wrong, the fear of putting ourselves out there in front of other people. You know, what can you imagine walking down the tunnel for the first time at home and there's 75,000 in the ground at Old Trafford? And a player's been dying to do this for 10 years. I guarantee you when he stood there, oh my, there is different feelings.
Yeah, the knees are knocking.
Oh, everything's knocking. I mean, you know, you're shaking, you're like a skeleton. But this bit on mentality, it's handling pressure, Mark. It's, you know, pressure becomes far bigger when you're not playing very well, when confidence has dwindled. You're a front player who scores goals and you hit a dry patch. It happens. And it'll carry on happening. And then all of a sudden in a game, you get the best golden chance of ever. It's inside the 6-yard box. And it's a tap-in. You lash it. And it goes 10 yards over the bar. And you're looking in front of everybody now. And it's just a hard gig. You know, and he has a partial responsibility to come back from that. But there's also a large responsibility now with people around him, his teammates, coaches, other auxiliary staff that are around the place. Everybody plays a part now, because it's a really simple fact, this: you never ever achieve anything on your own, ever. You're in a team. You win together, you draw together, and you lose together, which means accepting responsibilities.
Yeah, definitely. And by the way, you've just summed up my footballing career by saying 10 yards over the bar.
Hey, we should all be famous for something, Mark.
Yeah, no, great. Well, better at rugby kicks. In terms of from your point of view, is there a piece of advice that you would give to a young aspiring player who joins a Premier League academy?
Yeah, expect nothing. Drive for everything. Work as hard as you can. Every day you work is one day that you never get back if you don't work properly. You know, and when I say work properly, I mean effort. So even when it's not going right on the field, you try as hard as you can. You run as hard as you can. You tackle as hard as you can. You pass every ball with the greatest of intentions possible, even if it doesn't go right. Coaches handle that. You know, they like it when players are giving everything. So, you know, for me, it's expect nothing, achieve everything. And I would also say to this as well, Mark, never make money your God.
Do you, I know, like, I mean, I coach just sort of under 12 teams. But at that age, I'd much rather teach a kid that will listen and put the effort in than thinks it's Ronaldo. Do you think, like, all kids coming through the system now all want to be a Ronaldo or Messi, and it's just all about this tiki-taka football, which I know City's the best at anyway. But you just think that that effort of the running, the tackling, the grind, the ugly part of football is harder to get into a young player?
I think it's a good point that you make. But that's down to the culture of the place he's going to work in, Mark. And that's the bottom line. It gets enforced. If academy staff are doing their job properly, what you're talking about there is a footballing education. It's an education of the mind. It's an understanding that as a player, you have a responsibility to your teammates, not just to you. Because when you don't attempt to tackle, 10 other players have been left high and dry on the field, because it might lead to an attempt at your goal. So I think the point that you make is I always wanted my players to think that they could be as good as somebody else. I think that's really important. I think it's, I'm going to say this, Mark, and I know some listeners might go, I absolutely profoundly disagree with that, but I really don't mind. None of that bothered me ever, to be honest with you. I wanted the players I worked with to show their ego, because there's a relationship between ego and confidence. Those two qualities sleep in the same bed. They work together. But when ego goes rogue and thinks it's more important than anything else, then ego is no longer ego, it's now egotism. Now it's time to do something about it. But your top players in the game all have profound ego on the field and on the training ground. All those years ago when I watched George Best play for the first time, and my dad took me to Man United versus Leeds, and I saw this dark-haired genius that everybody was chanting his name around the ground at Old Trafford. He could do anything. He could pass it to a shout. He could dribble off both feet. He was lightning quick. He'd tackle. He'd head. He'd take all the stick given, and he scored goals. He was a genius. And since then, there's been loads of other geniuses. Ronaldo, Messi, and others. Why shouldn't players want to be like their heroes? There's nothing wrong with that. So I'd never knock that out of a player. What I would say is that we had a responsibility to educate him as to the other things that are important in the game.
I never had Paul McGuinness on recently as well, and he was just saying about watching Best. It was just a delight.
Oh, Mark, seriously, I have to say to you that he's the best player I've ever seen, ever. He was just something different. It's a day and age, by the way, when pitches were shocking. They're not these bowling greens like they are now, and where players are protected to a large degree by the rules of the game now. Some of the tackling in them days was almost violent, to be quite honest with you. And he was kicked black and blue. He was just a genius.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of those the old games, the Harrises and people like that used to just come in at knee height for tackles.
Oh yeah, and I'm not decrying today's modern heroes. Your Messis and your Ronaldos and your Zidanes that have gone before him, and Platini and people of that ilk. They're fantastic footballers. Messi's just on another planet at the moment. But I think I'll look back and George Best and I'll go, he was my first footballing hero. So I'm always going to say him.
I just have to ask, just as a side note here, I know he was at Man City for a long time, but is that your team or are you a Man United fan?
So here we go. I was at Man City for a very, very long time and I'm a Red. Right? I'm a Red because my dad was a Red and I was brought up on them. But I can genuinely say when I went to City and I worked with the people I worked with, the organisation from 2000 to 2010, which was so incredibly successful at player development, I never let them down by ever supporting Reds above Blues on the day. My heart was very, very much in blue. But when your blood runs red and you leave the blue, you become a Red again.
Fair enough. Blood transfusion on that one. And yeah. I think it's always the way, isn't it? I mean, you follow the team your dad supports, and if not, there's it gets awkward at Christmas.
That's so very true, by the way.
Yeah. And so what lessons would you have learned from your experiences, your time at City, that could benefit other clubs or organisations? Because I know obviously that's what you're doing more now.
There's a great conversation that goes around football regularly that I hear when I get in football crowds. And they all talk about this thing about, with young players, it's more important than for them to play well and what have you. I have to say, that's profound rubbish. Players have to be taught how to win. It's not a light switch. You can't reach 15 years of age, and prior to everything that goes before 15, everybody goes, you know, you played really well today, so don't worry about it, you played really well today. And then all of a sudden 15 comes and you go, you haven't won. It ain't a light switch that you switch on. It's a mindset you educate. And from my early days at Manchester City, right from the start, the thing that hit me straight away was that it was a winning organisation housed by winning mindsets. And it became a big deal. And I have to say, I found it one day when I actually wasn't coaching on the day of a game, and I walked into a changing room of under 12s players who'd lost a game. You try telling players who are mega disappointed about a game they've just lost that it's okay because they played well. They're going to look at you like you're a Martian. And rightly. It was really important to them. So I think that is a very key thing, by the way. And the second thing I would turn around and say is, every player is different. Don't expect him to be like his mate who sits next to him. Some of them are incredibly sensitive. So receiving verbal, shall we say, verbal discourse from an emotional coach will not do him any good in front of his mates. Simple as that. So you have to know your players and get to know them inside out. So as I said 10 minutes ago, whatever it was, some people call that being nosy. I call it being passionately curious.
Interesting point you made. Being as a former teacher, and I have this issue, and I get told off by my wife for saying this, but in PE now, in sports days and everything else, you get the participation medal and well done. You know, here's a kind of loser's medal, and I'm not a fan of that. It's like, no. You know, the old first place, if you're second, you're first place loser kind of thing, and maybe that's an old school thing, but it's like it's not the taking part that counts; it's the winning that counts. No?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, I know that people who listen to this might go, oh, hold on a minute. Life's competitive, Mark. It's as simple as that. You go for a job, you're in competition for the job with other people. What are you going to do when you come away? Somebody going to say to you, hey, don't worry. It's like, do you know one of the worst pieces of information or advice a parent can ever give their child in a high-performance environment is this. When he's not doing very well, they'll turn around and go, it's okay, it'll be all right, you know. Well, how do you know? It might be a lie, that. Tell them the truth. They're not doing very well. And they need to look inside themselves and go, I might need to look at how I'm performing. Did I give it 100% effort today? With real honesty and gusto in your answer. So don't tell them any lies. So I'm with you with what you've just asked about there. Life's competitive. What's wrong with winning? There's nothing wrong with it.
No, and that period of self-reflection you mentioned there as well. I mean, that's the opportunity. You know, if you lose, and you all lose, everybody loses. You know, you can't win everything. But when you lose, it's looking at why did you lose. You know, and if you keep telling people, "Oh, it'll be okay, next game, that's fine, carry on doing what you're doing," that's the definition of insanity, isn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, look, number one, losing is a hard gig. Okay, it hurts, and the older players get, and the more how can I put it, embraced into the game they become because they want it to be their career. It hurts even more. So people shouldn't think that their boy who comes home at the end of the day and they've lost the game 2-1 is going to be chuffed about things, because he ain't, and that's the bottom line at the end of the day. Okay, but the simple reality is that we have to teach, so you know, how to win from the start. And notice I use the word teach. We don't coach, in my opinion. We teach. You know, it's just a mindset that I have.
Yeah, absolutely. And so after your time at Man City, you set up. So am I right in saying that you set up Players Net, or is that the right company?
No, it's not actually. It's first team.
First Team. Okay. So you set
Yeah,
up First Team. Could you tell us a bit more about the work you do there?
yeah. I've taken all my knowledge, if you like, from creating high performance and turned it into working with clients and business. So leadership, mentoring skills, developing teams, um, working with senior managements to create teams down the line, teams within teams, if they want of a better way of saying it, because big organisations have teams within teams. It's impossible for all their managers to know everybody who, maybe 200 or 300 people who work in their department, but they have managers under them as well. So it's understanding how to create an ability to get the best out of people all of the time. I don't sit in the corner, by the way, Mark, of admonishing people left, right, and centre. I've never been in that corner. I've been in a corner which it was all about how do I get the best out of him. He might be a damn big challenge, but he is my challenge. So you've got to find ways. And if admonishing somebody makes them disappear, and it might be your best worker, then why would you do it? So it's about taking everything that I've learned, if you like that. And funny enough, I wrote to somebody today who asked me a question about bad performance, and I wrote back to them and said, it's a brilliant question you've asked me. I said, and I always considered it, watching somebody who was in a senior position who might be, shall we say, not acting in a way that is 100% appropriate. I never threw bad practice away. I never ignored it. Bad practice you can learn more from than you can from good practice. Because the question you ask is, how would I do it differently? So it's a bit like a coin. You flip the coin from the side it's on to the side you want it to land on. And you have to know what that side looks like before you pick it up. Because you've got people to work with. So I learned so much in professional football.
And I mean, I guess, how do you transfer that mindset of elite athletes into a business environment?
Do you know what? I have to say, this to me is all about your enthusiasm, your energy, your infectious nature. People who lead people shouldn't want their people just to be followers. They should want all their people to be leaders. Now, they're not all going to have responsibility lines. That doesn't mean to say they can't be leaders, Mark. Because there'll be something that happens throughout the course of every week where somebody is required to step up to the grade for whatever reason it might be. So we don't want people who are just followers. We want leaders all over the shop. The adage of the All Blacks is 1 captain, 15 leaders. If it's good enough for a winning organisation like them, why shouldn't it be good for every other organisation? Because it's not just sport. Rugby isn't just a game anymore, it's a business. And the business is affected by the winning on the pitch or not. So where we go is that we have to teach people to enthuse others, to inspire others, to know everybody that they work with, the ones that are closest to them, and say to those people, now you go out and do exactly the same thing. John Cotter used to call it creating a movement. He passed away a long time ago, but Cotter's 8-stage process for change, you go through that, it's real clever. And I look at that today, I don't know when that was written, 30, 40 years ago, whatever. I look at that today and think, genius. Absolute genius.
So what qualities make a good captain or leader?
Somebody who can be tough when he needs to be tough. Okay, I'm saying him, it could be a her, obviously. Somebody who can be tough when they need to be tough. Somebody who's I like to think emotionally intelligent, is authentic, has natural empathy with his teammates or workers or fellow employees around them. You can't have natural empathy, by the way, if you're not authentic, Mark. You just can't. Because you can destroy empathy with creating blame cultures. And inconsistent leaders create blame cultures. So those are qualities. He has to care. He has to never run out of energy, whether he likes it or not. And he has to understand the fact that his teammates are going to look up to him, whether he likes it or not. You see, last night in the FA Cup game against Newcastle, the last penalty, which was missed by the Blackburn player, was the Blackburn captain. But he stepped up to the plate and he took responsibility. And I bet today he's accepted his responsibilities. And I bet his teammates love him for that. You know, so there's loads of qualities. There's not just one. And it's not about bawling and shouting, although there are times.
Yeah, sometimes you need it. I mean, how hard is it to train or instill leadership qualities in someone who might be deemed as an introvert?
I've never believed in the phrases introvert and extrovert. I have to say to you, I've never believed in it. I mean, I was quiet at one stage in my life. Anybody who knows me now said, "Go quiet? You've never been quiet in your life." But I have. I used to be quiet. To me, you've got to get those people spending time with other people who are infectious, Mark, who inspire through their energy and their desire to want to improve and their ability to handle failure, because it's a mega, mega important thing. So, if I'm honest with you, I've never found that tough. I've never found it hard to work with people who are quiet. You can be a captain and be quiet. Leading by example, as people say. You know, walking round when a player's on the deck and he's blowing through his backside, excuse the phrase, because it's really physically tough, and an arm goes on your shoulder and you see it's your captain and he doesn't say nothing to you. But he doesn't need to. It's the fact that he's put his arm on your shoulder. That's good enough.
I mean, coming back to quickly on that, because Manchester United, I think that there was, there's that talk of that leadership void there. Do you think that's, and we know the class of '92, that team had Keane and it had Scholes and Beckham and everybody there was a leader. Do you think that's part of that big shift at Manchester United at the moment?
There's been too many changes at Manchester United, and I'm sure that Manchester United, as a football club presently, right now, will acknowledge that. I think that what you say is partly true, because at the end of the day, greatness isn't created unless there's the great qualities to create it from. And the word great, this is not a swear word, by the way, I'm giving it you as a slang word. The word great is a bastardized word now. It's used too often, too soon, too early. I used to hate it when I'd listen to people saying to players, "You've had a great game, you're a great player." There's no great players at 14 and 15 years of age. There's players with great potential, but even that potential can crash and burn. And for whatever reason doesn't get there. But there is without doubt, when you transition, you lose what you naturally had prior to transition. You talked about the class of '92 and then Roy Keane, who came in from Nottingham Forest when Ferguson brought him in, and people of that ilk. Dennis Irwin was another one. These players with fantastic abilities, but unbelievable leadership qualities as well. Manchester City have got that in droves now. Because to say that, for people to imply that they lack leaders, which I've heard, by the way, might be one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard. Because people who win those amount of things, they don't do it through not being natural leaders to some degree. They might not all be captains, by the way, but they're all captains in a team.
I was just saying, I know you had also had a trademark, which I read, which is "say it as it is." Can you explain a bit more about that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I just don't. I don't like all this flowery stuff, Mark. You know, when people, go, don't so direct with a player. No, be direct with a player. If he's miffed you for whatever reason, let him know. But just tell him properly. It doesn't mean to say you have to go effing and blinding at him, because we didn't do that. We had an unwritten rule that coaches never did that with players in conversation or at players. It was an unwritten rule, and we didn't expect the players to do it either. That was shall we say, an informal education process. But say as it is, for me, it's just, don't wrap it up in a Christmas parcel with a nice little bow on it. Just tell people straight and be honest. I don't know if you ever listen to political programs every now and then. I've found myself watching a few recently because I like to see the characters that are on there. How many times do you ever get a politician answering a question?
Oh, that's why. What's the point in listening to it? It's just waffle.
Correct. They either have no idea how to answer it, they're frightened of answering it, or they're told not to answer it. But either way, they don't answer it. So there's no point asking them a question. And a yes or no question, which is a closed question. If you get asked a yes or no question and it requires a yes or no answer, give the answer. So say it as it is. It ain't rocket science.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a book I read. I can't remember who the author was now, but Feedback and Other Dirty Words, where that culture in business where people don't like to give feedback, or as you say, they would give it in a way that's they give some good feedback, but then they take away the impact of that by softening the blow. And I think there's a constructive way to give feedback. Without question, it's a skill, Mark. What you talk about there, that comes from people with natural empathy. That they know how to speak to people, good and bad. Because good leaders tell you when they're chuffed. They also know you tell you when they've got to step up to the plate. Plain and simple. You can't always have. You can't have all the sugar without a little bit of bitter. And we've removed the bitter from life these days. It's an incredibly woke society now. And I can't lie to you, it drives me spare. Yeah, it is. I mean, and again, the Man City connection here, just because I was listening to one of his podcasts the other day, but Joey Barton has one. He's kind of gone. Well, do you think he's gone too far, or do you think actually some of that is sensible? I think I caught the same podcast. Correct me if I'm wrong. Was he speaking about things like women commentators and stuff like that? Yeah. Okay, so I listened to Joey's podcast. I really like Joey, by the way. Okay. I was lucky enough to work with Joey for a short period of time. I found him incredibly respectful, diligently honest, a consummate professional in coming to the academy on a daily basis, never late, never first out the doors, a real pro. But I listened to that podcast the other day, and I just didn't agree at all. But he's entitled to his opinions, as I'm entitled to mine. And, to differ is a good thing sometimes. Some people, the problem is now with social media, if you have an opinion and people don't agree, you just get jumped on, trolls. It's just like, oh, Jesus. I will have said things today that I'm sure that some listeners will go, I really don't agree with that. And that's fine, by the way, because for starters, it creates discussion. And that has to be a good thing. But you're right, by the way, about social media. It's profoundly good in many ways, and it's incredibly dangerous in others. And can you tell us a little bit about your book, The Language of Winning, and who is that aimed at?
I always had a desire to write a book. And then one day somebody says to me, why haven't you written a book? And I answered, no idea. So I was in the company of some people one day and we were talking about potentially me writing a book. And this person turned around to me and said, you've got some fantastic ideas there. I think you should call it The Language of Winning. And I looked at that person, because that title's not mine, by the way. I always give it to credit to people who deserve the credit. That's not my title. This person gave me that title and said, call it The Language of Winning. And it's effectively a book that's aimed at people who want to read something, that who get, how can I put it, the analogies that are used in the book, the sporting analogies, some of which are under-embellished and not over-embellished, by the way, and which describe how you create a winning culture, a high-performance environment, if you like. Not all of the things that go in there that are important. I left things out. Maybe to write The Language of Winning too. Who knows? But the things that are in there are truly relevant. You know, and so I aimed it at business people. I didn't want it to be a tough read, Mark. I wanted it to be an easy read, an enjoyable read, where people would be able to link the analogies that I was using to things that might be happening for them in their environment, if you like. Because there is no difference between business and sport, because sport is business. There's zero difference. You know, high performance is high performance anywhere. Poor performance is poor performance anywhere. And so it was aimed at business people and people who especially work with teams of people. Whether it's been successful or not, I don't know from that respect. But from the people who've read it, they've given me really good feedback. So
we can ask for.
Absolutely.
And Pete, where can people find you online? How can they reach out to you?
They can reach out to me at pete@petelowe.com. They can find me on WhatsApp. They'll see me sitting with 2 trophies by my side. My favourite picture from the days when somebody else won them at Manchester City, but we all had our photographs taken with them. So that'll be my profile picture. They'll find me on LinkedIn, because there'll always be the connection with Manchester City written by the side of it. And I'm happy to take direct messages. It's not a problem whatsoever. Or they can also get me on another email address, which is pete@first-team.net.
Yeah, I'll put everything in the description anyway, so people will be able to get hold of you, no problem. But I could chat for ages, actually, and I'd certainly like to talk more about Manchester United, but probably you might not.
No, I'm happy to do it, Mark. It's not a problem, mate. For me personally, right now, the jury's still out. I know that's really harsh, because he has dealt with an awful lot. A culture in free fall. Owners of a football club who want to sell the football club. It's obviously a cash cow to them. This year he's had proliferation of injuries, but respectfully, it is Manchester United. And it is a damn big football club. Might be the biggest football club in the world. I personally think it is, by history. You know, it has a tragically magical past. If that makes any sense. You know, its tragedies created a lot of its magic. And the people who came from tragedy, for the want of a better way, have helped create the most magic of places. Right now, it's not very magic. And it has a lot to do to regenerate that magic. An awful lot to do.
You know, funny enough, when I look at I was speaking to somebody last night, as I say, I support West Ham, and you think Ten Hag came from Ajax, and he took Anthony there and left Kudos. And I think Kudos, he just looks like he's a grafter, he's forward thinking. Anthony looks really stroppy. I think he's like a Bruno Fernandes, who he's a quality player. No one can dispute that, but just one of those that throws their hands up. They just don't, like, that would not be allowed under Ferguson or with Keane or those in the team.
Point. Well, that's a great point. So if you go back to some of the halcyon days, and Erik Cantona was playing, the magical Frenchman. You had Keane, and the young kids had come through, and your Neville and your Butt and your Giggs and your Scholes. You're talking now about a team of players who were all of them were just magnificent footballers. But they were also magnificent drivers and triers and effort drivers and energy-driven geezers who got on at each other and G'd each other up, give each other a bit of stick when they needed to do it, didn't roll over and play die on the field, didn't hold the shin when they've got a little bit of a tap. It's something that's crept into the game that's profoundly horrible, and it needs dealing with. I have some good friends, by the way, Mark, who are from the world of rugby union, and I love rugby union. I love it. I think the product of international rugby union is just fantastic to watch. And these people crash into each other, just knock 10 barrels out of each other. And there might be a fight every now and then. But they get up. Nobody rolls over and plays dead like they've been shot by a sniper from the woods. It's a part of the game which is horrible. And it needs dealing with.
Yeah, imagine if Chopper Harris was around now. It'd be ridiculous.
Oh. I mean, I remember his description on the Time of Our Lives that Jess Stelling used to front, and he had on Chopper Harris, he had on David Webb and Peter Bonetti, and he asked the question about the best player he'd ever played against to Chopper Harris, and I think it was David Webb who said, "Go on, tell him about the game," and he was making reference to George Best and the torrid time that he gave him at Old Trafford in the League Cup when he scored just an amazing goal. And he said, I had 2 efforts at bringing him down with the best, he said, I'd ever got, which meant kicking him. And he said he still got up and put it in the back of the net, or words to effect of that. Whereas now you go that you can look at some players now in today's modern era, they roll over and die. In obviously in performance terms, it's just it doesn't give the game a great image.
No, it doesn't.
Really
It teaches kids to do it. And funny enough, we had a club doctor on as well, and I was asking him about it, and he said that before that he coached a women's team, London Lionesses, and he just said like they don't do it, and even they laugh at the men's game where they just get a tap and they're rolling around, and it's like, geez,
it really is horrible, Mark. I mean, at one time, I go back in my early years of academy. If we'd had any players that did that, we wouldn't need to tell them from the touchline. Their own teammates would tell them. And people, they've kind of attributed it, if you like, to the onset of foreign players into our game. That might have been the reason. I don't know if it was. But it's no excuse for it to still continue. Diving in penalty areas, trying to. Okay, look, people will go, it's professionalism, etc., etc. Do you know what? I've been a professional in a professional game. I draw the line at that. I hate it.
Is that gamesmanship or game management? They just dress it up as other things, trying to kill time and all this, but. Yeah, I hate it. And I do think it was the influx of foreign players. That's kind of where it started. I mean, the Klinsmann dive was a classic one. It's obvious, that sort of thing. But yeah, I hate it.
And there've been many incidences, by the way, just as bad since then. but from some of our own players as well. Every weekend you see some sort of potential penalty incident that is inappropriate. Put it any way you want. And that's me saying it as it is, by the way. Don't wrap it up in a Christmas parcel. Say as it is. It is.
Yeah. Actually, just the one last question. I keep thinking these last questions, sorry. But with because you're talking about the diving and things like that, VAR, I have to ask VAR, as somebody who's been in the game for a long time, are you for VAR or against it?
I think that you have to be for it. Because the game's become so quick now. It's quicker than it ever was. For referees and assistant referees, that must be one of the most ridiculous changes of names I've ever come across, from a linesman to an assistant referee. Anyway, that's another issue. The game has become so quick now that I think it's really physically impossible for them to see almost everything. The bit that I find hard to swallow is when I hear commentators and people saying it's taken 4.5 minutes to get to that decision. So what? Providing they get to the right decision, isn't that what really matters? Because every weekend, if you watch an international rugby match and the TMO is involved, they might run it over and over and over. Because a good friend of mine was a TMO until recently. And we spoke about this when we were together last. And he asked me for my opinion on it. And I said, I don't get it. And he said, you're right. It's about coming to the right decision. If it comes to the right decision, Mark, most of the time, brilliant. What doesn't help the game is some of the rules. The rules around handball are ludicrous. Absolutely ludicrous. I mean, they might as well put a referee's arms up behind his shoulder blades and say, referee the game, by the way, without a whistle. It's madness. And these people who make these changes need to take a damn good look at themselves. Because it's making the game incredibly difficult. But I think VAR is a step forward for the game, in my opinion. I'd love to see the offside rule change, by the way. You know, when a man's hand is in front of a defending player and he's offside, respectfully, that's ridiculous. Because anybody setting forward on a forward run will naturally lean forwards. I'm doing it now, right? So you've got to have a defining line. So if you're going to have a defining line, take it off his feet.
Agreed. Definitely agree with that one, yeah.
But not this bit when his nose is in front of a defending player. What the hell is that all about? It's ridiculous.
I think we could go down a rabbit hole with VAR and offside and that, Pete. But I've kept you long enough, and I really do appreciate your time. It's been brilliant. Really enjoyed it, and thank you very much for that. I will put the links, as mentioned, to everything in the description. Thank you very much for your time and for being an unsung hero of sport.
You are very, very welcome, Mark. Anytime.
Thank you.